Imagine standing in a field of waist-high grass under a Cuban sun so punishing it feels like it is pressing down on your skull. The air is thick with humidity, gunpowder, and the metallic smell of blood. You can hear the snap of Mauser rounds cutting through the air above you, each one a small thunderclap that screams someone on the ridge above has you in their sights. Men around you are falling. Some cry out. Others simply sink into the grass and vanish, as though the earth itself is swallowing them. You have been lying here for hours, pinned down, waiting for an order that may never come. And then you hear a voice, high-pitched, almost squeaky, nothing like you would expect from a war hero, shouting for everyone to get up and charge, straight up that hill and into the bullets. Welcome to Venerable Lives, the podcast where we dig into the single most defining moments that turn people into the figures history remembers. I am your host, Thomas, and today we are telling the story of Theodore Roosevelt and the day he rode a horse named Little Texas straight into Spanish gunfire on a hillside in Cuba. It was July 1st, 1898. Roosevelt was 39 years old, wearing spectacles held on with a string, a blue polka dot bandana around his neck, and carrying a revolver that had been salvaged from the sunken battleship Maine. In a few minutes, he would do something so reckless, so audacious, and so deeply rooted in everything he had survived up to that point that it would change the trajectory of American history. This story is more than just a war tale. The man who charged up that hill was the same boy who 3 decades earlier could barely climb a flight of stairs without gasping for air. The same man who, 14 years before this moment, had drawn a black X across a diary page and written the most devastating sentence a husband can write. This is a story about what happens when a person decides not once, but over and over again across an entire lifetime that the only direction worth moving is forward. Can you imagine what it takes to build that kind of resolve? To understand the man on the horse, we need to start with the boy in the bed. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27th, 1858, in a brownstone on East 20th Street in Manhattan, into one of the wealthiest families in New York City. The Roosevelts were old Dutch money, the kind of family that endowed museums and summered in the Alps. His father, Theodore Sr., was a philanthropist and civic leader who young Teddy would later describe as the greatest man he ever knew, the ideal man. His mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, known as Mitty, was a Georgia belle who brought warmth and storytelling into the household. On paper, it was a golden childhood. In reality, it was shaped by one brutal fact: the boy could not breathe. Roosevelt suffered from asthma so severe that his parents genuinely feared he would not survive past the age of 4. Think about that for a moment. 4 years old, and the people who love you most are already preparing for the possibility that your lungs will simply refuse to carry you any farther. Night after night, young Teddy would bolt upright in bed, his chest locked, his mouth open, in a silent scream as his airways constricted. His father would scoop him up, this big, barrel-chested man, cradling a fragile, wheezing child, and pace the hallways of the brownstone for hours. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Theodore Sr. would bundle his son into a carriage and drive through the cold Manhattan streets at speed, hoping the rush of frigid air would shock the boy's lungs into opening. Picture that scene. A horse-drawn carriage rattling through empty streets at 2 or 3 in the morning, a father holding his son upright, both of them praying for the next breath to come. Confined to bed for long stretches, Teddy found companionship in books. He devoured everything he could reach: natural history, adventure stories, tales of heroes who struggled against impossible odds and won. He was especially fascinated by the natural world. He collected specimens with an obsessive zeal: insects, bird nests, mouse skulls, filling his bedroom with what his mother politely called his natural history museum. I'm not sure the household staff found it so charitable. The books and the specimens fed something in him, a hunger, the sense that the body trapping him in that bed was a problem he intended to solve, not a fate he intended to accept. When he was 12 years old, his father gave him the words that would simply become the engine of his entire life. "You have the mind," his father told him, "but you have not the body. And without the help of the body, your mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It is hard, but I know you will do it." Theodore Sr. built a gym on the second-floor piazza of their home, and young Teddy attacked it with a ferocity that startled everyone who knew him. He boxed, he lifted weights, he wrestled, he hiked through the countryside with a determination that bordered on mania. The asthma never fully left him, and it would shadow him well into adulthood. But the boy began to build something around it, a shell of physical will so thick that the disease could knock on the door but never quite break through. By the time he entered Harvard at 17, Roosevelt was compact, broad-shouldered, and possessed an almost manic energy that classmates found either exhilarating or exhausting, depending on how long they had been around him. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who seems to vibrate at a higher frequency than everyone else in the room. That was Teddy, and the vibration was not natural. It was manufactured, built one agonizing rep at a time in a home gym by a boy who was terrified of being fragile. At Harvard, Roosevelt threw himself into everything: boxing, rowing, natural history, and the social scene. And he fell deeply in love with a young woman named Alice Hathaway Lee. She was 17, bright, beautiful, and initially unimpressed by this intense young man who pursued her with the subtlety of a cavalry charge. He proposed. She hesitated. He proposed again, and again. She finally said yes, and on their wedding day, in October of 1880, Roosevelt told friends he felt like the luckiest man alive. They settled into a life of ambition and warmth. He entered politics, winning a seat in the New York State Assembly at just 23, the youngest man to hold the position at that time. Alice became pregnant. Everything was pointing upwards. Everything was bright. In February 1884, that light would go out. Valentine's Day, the cruelest possible date for what was about to happen. Roosevelt's mother, Mittie, had been suffering from what the family believed was a severe cold. It was typhoid fever. At 3 o'clock in the morning, in the family home on 57th Street, she passed. She was 49 years old. Roosevelt, who had rushed home from Albany through a thick fog that seemed to hang over the entire city like a funeral shroud, barely had time to process what had happened before he was called upstairs. Alice, his Alice, 22 years old, just 2 days past giving birth to their first daughter, was dying. Bright's disease, an acute kidney failure that had been masked by the pregnancy. She was so ill she could barely recognize him when he knelt beside her bed. She could not see him clearly. She could not speak his name. 11 hours after his mother drew her last breath in the room downstairs, Alice died in his arms. In the same house, on the same day. Can you even hold that in your mind? Two of the people you love most in the world gone in the span of a single, impossible day. What do you do with that? How does a 25-year-old man stand in a house where death has taken up residence on 2 floors and find a reason to keep moving? Roosevelt opened his pocket diary that night. He drew a large black X across the page, and beneath it, in handwriting that historians say looks steady, almost eerily controlled, he wrote a single line: "The light has gone out of my life." He would never speak Alice's name again, not in letters, not in conversation, not in his autobiography, which spans hundreds of pages and covers nearly every other detail of his life. He simply erased her from the record, as though the pain of remembering was a wound that would never close if he kept touching it. He left the infant, also named Alice, with his older sister Bamie, and he fled. He went as far west as he could. For 2 years, Roosevelt lived in the Dakota Badlands. He ranched cattle on a plot he called Elkhorn Ranch, sleeping under open sky and temperatures that dropped well below zero. He chased horse thieves and broke broncos, and once spent 3 days tracking down a group of boat thieves in a frozen river, capturing them and marching them 40 miles through mud and ice to the nearest sheriff while reading Tolstoy to pass the time. He punched a drunk in a saloon who called him Four Eyes and mocked his spectacles. He ate meals of hardtack and venison, grew a weather-beaten face, and earned the grudging respect of cowboys who had initially dismissed the bespectacled Easterner as a dude playing rancher. What would you have done if you were in his place? With the weight of that kind of loss pressing down on you, would you have crumbled? Would you have retreated into a quiet life? Roosevelt did the opposite. He ran toward the hardest thing he could find and dared it to break him. When he came back east, he was different, broader, harder, more driven. He remarried to his childhood friend, Edith Caro, and threw himself back into politics with the ferocity of a man who understood that the only way to survive grief was to outrun it. He served on the Civil Service Commission. He became president of the New York City Police Board, famously walking the streets at midnight in a black cloak to catch officers sleeping on duty or consorting with criminals. He was a one-man Reformation engine, and he made enemies at every turn, which suited him just fine. In 1897, President McKinley appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was one of the most prestigious posts in Washington. Roosevelt immediately began using it to argue, loudly and publicly, that the United States needed to prepare for war with Spain over Cuba. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 266 American sailors in a blast that shook buildings across the waterfront, Roosevelt saw his moment, but not from behind a desk. On May 6, 1898, he resigned his position. Let that sink in for a moment. He walked away from one of the most powerful jobs in federal government to volunteer for combat. His friends thought he had lost his mind. The political establishment in Washington whispered that he was throwing away a brilliant career for a romantic fantasy. Even his own wife, Edith, later admitted she had been terrified by the decision. But Roosevelt had spent his entire life building himself into a man who ran toward difficulty, not away from it, and he was not about to sit in Washington reading dispatches while other men did the fighting. Roosevelt and Colonel Leonard Wood formed the first United States Volunteer Cavalry, and from the moment they opened recruitment in San Antonio, Texas, the response was staggering. 23,000 men applied for roughly 1,000 spots, and what 1,000 they were. Can you picture this group? Arizona cowboys who could shoot a rattlesnake from horseback, standing shoulder to shoulder with Harvard polo players and Yale track stars. Cherokee and Pawnee riders from the Indian Territory, bunking next to New York City policemen. Former outlaws sharing mess kits with sons of senators. A Texas Ranger sleeping 10 feet from a Wall Street broker. The newspaper dubbed them the Rough Riders, and the name stuck because it captured something true. These were men from every corner of America, united by the peculiar magnetism of a bespectacled former asthmatic who had somehow convinced them all to follow him into war. They even had to turn away some extraordinary volunteers. Buffalo Bill Cody applied and was declined, along with prize-fighters James Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons. The brother of Jesse James, Frank James, didn't have any luck. They sailed for Cuba in mid-June aboard crowded transports. The journey was chaos. There were not enough ships for every regiment, and Roosevelt, displaying the bulldozer instinct that would define his political career, commandeered a vessel originally assigned to 2 other units. The horses, over 1,200 of them, had to be left behind, which meant the vaunted volunteer cavalry would fight on foot. All except Roosevelt, who managed to get his horse, a small, sturdy animal named Little Texas, onto the boat through sheer force of will and a creative interpretation of shipping orders. When they landed at Daiquiri on June 22nd, the Rough Riders waded ashore through the surf, their equipment waterlogged, into a landscape of dense jungle, oppressive heat, and an enemy they could hear but could not see. The first real action came at Las Guasimas on June 24th. A sharp skirmish in the jungle broke out where the Rough Riders took 16 casualties, and Roosevelt got his first taste of what it meant to hear bullets cut the air inches from his face. He later described the sound as a peculiar zipping noise, like tearing silk. But that was just a prelude. The main event was coming. The Spanish army had fortified the ridgeline, running from Kettle Hill on the north to San Juan Hill on the south, overlooking the road to Santiago de Cuba. If the Americans could not take those hills, the entire campaign would stall, and the Spanish were dug in with Mauser rifles, artillery, barbed wire, and the high ground. Everything favored them. July 1st, 1898, dawned brutally hot. The temperature climbed toward 100 degrees before noon, and the air was so thick with humidity that men described it as feeling like breathing through a wet cloth. The American forces, roughly 8,000 soldiers from multiple regiments, including the Rough Riders, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the legendary Black regiments who had been fighting America's frontier wars for decades, moved into position in the low ground below the hills. They waited. The orders to advance were delayed, confused, and contradicted. An observation balloon, meant to help direct artillery fire, instead hovered directly over American positions, like a giant floating arrow pointing down at them, essentially painting a target for the Spanish gunners. When the balloon was finally shot down, it crashed into the trees and blocked the trail, creating a bottleneck of men and mules in the worst possible place. Soldiers cursed it as they climbed over and around the wreckage. For hours, soldiers lay in the tall grass while Mauser rounds snapped overhead and Spanish artillery shells burst into the tree line. Men were dying where they lay, not in a glorious charge, but in the slow, agonizing realization that they would never see another sunrise. Waiting, sweating, listening to the man next to them stop breathing. Richard Harding Davis, the famous war correspondent who was embedded with the troops, later wrote that the American soldiers walked to greet death at every step. Many of them disappeared in the high grass, but others moved forward, stubbornly forming a thin line that kept creeping higher and higher up the hill. Can you feel what that must have been like? The sun hammering down, the grass so tall you cannot see more than a few feet in any direction, and the constant crack of rifle fire from a ridge you cannot quite reach. How long could you lie there before the waiting became worse than the bullets? Roosevelt was furious. He paced behind the lines, his face flushed, his fists clenching and unclenching, watching his men bleed while orders failed to arrive. Colonel Leonard Wood had been promoted to brigade command, which meant Roosevelt was now in sole command of the Rough Riders. The order to advance finally came at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, relayed through a chain of confused messengers. And the instant he received it, Roosevelt leapt onto Little Texas. He was the only mounted officer in the entire assault. Think about what that means. Every other officer had the good sense to stay low, to advance on foot, to present as small of a target as possible to the Spanish sharpshooters on the ridge. Roosevelt sat on top of a horse. He became a lightning rod in an open field. He was wearing his spectacles, held on with a string, because he had broken his regular pair days earlier. The blue polka dot bandana was knotted at his throat. A revolver was in his right hand, and he kicked Little Texas forward, directly up the slope of Kettle Hill, shouting for his men to follow. The Rough Riders surged behind him. Alongside them came the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry, men who had been fighting and dying beside them all day, with a valor that history has only recently begun to fully acknowledge. Roosevelt later called the next stretch of time his crowded hour, the single hour in which an entire life's worth of living was compressed into one explosive burst. He rode through a hail of Mauser fire, waving his hat with his free hand, shouting for the line to keep moving forward. A bullet grazed his elbow, drawing blood. He barely noticed. Men fell around him. Rough Riders, Buffalo Soldiers, regular infantry, tumbling into the same grass they had been hiding in moments before. But the line kept moving, up and up, through the heat and gunfire and the sheer physical agony of climbing a hill in the Cuban summer while people are trying to kill you. When Roosevelt reached the crest of Kettle Hill, The fighting became hand-to-hand in the Spanish trenches, bayonets, rifle butts, and fists. The Spanish defenders, outnumbered and overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault, broke and ran. Roosevelt stood on the summit, spectacles fogged with sweat, chest heaving, and looked across the valley to the south. San Juan Hill, the main Spanish fortified position, was still being contested. American infantry were struggling up its slope under withering fire, and Roosevelt, without waiting for orders, without pausing to consolidate his position or tend to his wounded, gathered what men he could and charged again. Down the slope of Kettle Hill, across the valley under fire, and up toward the San Juan Heights. What would you have done in that moment? You have just survived one impossible charge. Your men are exhausted, bleeding. Some of them are barely able to stand, and you decide to do it again. Where does that come from? By nightfall, both Kettle Hill and the San Juan Heights were in American hands. The cost had been staggering. Over 200 American soldiers dead, including 26 Buffalo soldiers, and 1,200 wounded in a single day of fighting. The field hospitals overflowed. Surgeons worked by lamplight through the night, and the smell of ether and blood hung in the tropical air for days afterward. But the road to Santiago was open, and the Spanish garrison would surrender within weeks. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. The entire conflict had lasted just over 3 months, but the battle that decided it, the one the world would remember, had taken a single afternoon. And Theodore Roosevelt, standing on that hilltop in a soaked, mud-caked uniform, surrounded by cheering men from every corner of America, his horse, Little Texas, somehow still alive beneath him, had become the most famous man in the country. Not because he was the bravest, or the strongest, or the most tactically brilliant officer on that field. He was not. The Buffalo soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry fought with equal courage and took heavier proportional casualties. Regular infantry regiments stormed positions that were even more heavily defended, but Roosevelt had something those other men did not have. A story that the public already wanted to believe. The sickly boy who made himself strong. The grieving husband who rode into the wilderness and came back harder. The desk man who quit his job to fight. And now, the man on horseback, charging uphill into the bullets, spectacles glinting in the Cuban sun. Within 2 years, Roosevelt was governor of New York. Within 3, he was vice president, a position the party bosses had pushed him into precisely because they thought it would neutralize his reformist energy. It was, they believed, a political dead end, and it would have been if an anarchist named Leon Kolgosh had not shot President William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo on September 6, 1901. McKinley lingered for 8 days before dying, and then Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States at the age of 42, the youngest in the nation's history. The party boss, Thomas Platt, who had engineered the vice presidential nomination to get Roosevelt out of New York, reportedly said upon hearing the news that a damned cowboy was president of the United States. He would go on to bust monopolies, build the Panama Canal, establish 5 national parks and 18 national monuments, and win the Nobel Prize for negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and fundamentally reshape the American presidency into the muscular activist office we recognize today. All of it powered by the same philosophy he had been building since he was 12 years old. The strenuous life, the conviction that greatness is not given, but seized. So what do we take from Theodore Roosevelt and his crowded hour? I think the easy lesson is about courage, and it is true enough. Roosevelt was brave on that hillside, recklessly, almost absurdly brave. But I think the deeper lesson is about what courage actually is and where it comes from. We tend to celebrate bravery as though it appears in certain people fully formed, like a birthright or a genetic gift. You are either brave or you are not. Roosevelt's story tells us something more uncomfortable, and I think far more useful. His courage was manufactured. It was built in a home gym by a 12-year-old boy who could not breathe and refused to accept that as a final word. It was tempered in the frozen Badlands by a 25-year-old man who was running from a grief so enormous he could not speak his dead wife's name. It was sharpened on the midnight streets of New York, in the boxing ring, in the political arena, and in 1,000 small moments where the easier path was to stay comfortable. And finally, definitively proven on a Cuban hillside by a 39-year-old man who had spent his entire life preparing for a test he did not know was coming. The boy who could not breathe became the man who would not stop charging. And the distance between those two versions of Theodore Roosevelt is not talent. It is not destiny. It is not some mysterious quality that some people are born with and others are not. It is a choice made over and over again on the worst days and the best ones to move forward when every instinct says to stay down, to get on the horse when every other officer is staying on the ground, to charge again when you have already survived one impossible assault. Have you ever faced a moment like that in your own life? Maybe not on a hillside under fire, but a moment where the safer path was to stay low, stay quiet, and let someone else take the risk. What did you choose? And if you had to do it over, knowing what Roosevelt's story teaches us, that courage is not something you find, but something you build, what would you choose this time? That is our story for today. If it made you think, if it made you want to get up and charge at something in your own life, I would love it if you would share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Leave us a review. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to our newsletter at venerablelives.com, where we cover our next character. Come back tomorrow, because we have another extraordinary story waiting for you, another defining moment, another crossroads, another person who made an extraordinary choice and changed the course of history. Until then, I am your host, Thomas, and this has been Venerable Lives.